Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 3 in my deep dive on dependent personality disorder. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast, but I'm going to have a little intro here. Today's chapter, I'm going to talk about, I think it's going to be the final chapter, I'm going to talk about outcomes of dependent personality disorder, like what happens, like what relationship problems people have with it, that sort of thing, victimization of others, victimization by others. I'm going to talk about the history of the construct, kind of in brief, kind of not, and I'm going to talk about the treatment. But first, I want to give you the third example, the fictional composite of a fictional person I'm naming Tammy. So Tammy is our third case example. We talked about Aiden in Chapter 1. We talked about Michelle in Chapter 2. Talked about Tammy in Chapter 3. And as I always say, these examples are completely fictionalized. They're cobbled together from probably, 30 to 50 people that I can reference. And any one of those people would not recognize themselves in this description. All right. So Tammy, she was terribly traumatized as a child. So with Aiden and Michelle, we didn't see tremendous abuse, but with Tammy, we see lots and lots of abuse, lots of chaos. As a teen, she mostly kept to herself. She saw herself as a loser, and she was very envious of other kids. She had terribly low self-esteem. She had complex PTSD. She sometimes thought about suicide. Every day, at some point, an invasive thought would invade her brain that she was worthless and no one would ever love her. She tried hard in school, though. Other students saw her as the teacher's pet. She would stay after school and talk with the teachers, and she did whatever they asked her to do. She felt safe with the teachers, much more so than she did with her peers. As an adult, she struggled in relationships. She often found herself with abusive partners, and she would stay way too long in those relationships. When friends told her to leave, she said she would leave, but she only said that to please them, and she knew she would actually never leave. She still thought about suicide as an adult. She saw herself as a burden to everyone. She thought the world would be better off without her. She sometimes fantasized about people missing her after she died. At work, though, she finally found where she could shine. At work, she knew what was required of her. If she did a good job, she was rewarded. There was a structure at work. So she poured all of her hopes and dreams into the job. Soon, she was considered to be the hardest worker at the company. Everyone loved her. She was nice to everyone. In fact, she was really, really, really nice to everyone. She often spoke in ways that emphasized her rank in relation to her bosses. She excessively mentioned that she was an underling to her bosses frequently, in ways that really no one else did. She excessively showered her bosses with praise. When given the chance, she would publicly praise her bosses. Some of her bosses were annoyed with this behavior, but they said nothing. Other bosses liked it. She was extremely pessimistic about the future. She assumed the worst would happen in all situations. She often talked about how the company was going to go bankrupt and go out of business. Other coworkers did not see the world this way, but they said nothing because she was so nice. She often seemed anxious and overworked by her coworkers. Her coworkers thought, wow, she's so anxious and she's so overworked. She was never at ease or calm. She was always on the go and stressed out. At times, she even liked being seen as someone who burnt the candle at both ends. It showed how hard she worked. She liked being seen that way. It helped to make her feel safe. She was extremely preoccupied with what her coworkers thought of her, particularly her bosses. She needed contact with her coworkers, but particularly her bosses, practically every day. She would email, text, call, etc. with her bosses all day long, multiple times. She was eager to please. With some bosses, they accommodated her and talked with her every day. But other bosses disliked how needy she was. However, under all of that eager compliance and subservience, she had tremendous rage. She had a lifetime of anger that had rarely ever been expressed. Deep down, she resented everyone she served. She resented everyone she worked with. She resented everyone she had ever been involved with. And she only occasionally even felt this anger consciously. But she would express this anger through hidden ways, sometimes hidden even to her. For example, she would defy her bosses while verbally praising them. In her conscious mind, she thought her bosses were great, but unconsciously, she hated them with a passion. She would subtly undermine her bosses and her coworkers. For example, she would subtly insult people behind their backs in a way that, if you heard it, you might not even recognize it as an insult, but it was definitely an insult. It was a passive insult. She would secretly sabotage her bosses. For example, she would fail to follow through on tasks that she was ordered to do or given. But since she was so nice, quote unquote, everyone figured it was just because she was overworked. But in fact, she was not overworked. She purposely would fail the task as a way of expressing her vast amount of anger and resentment. Anger at her bosses, anger at her coworkers, anger at her past relationships, and anger at the world. When one of her bosses would not allow her to enmesh with them, she turned on the boss. She became openly rageful and even mildly delusional with the boss. She falsely accused her boss of several transgressions that were not true, that were mildly delusional, and she believed these transgressions were true because of her distorted lens, due to her trauma, and due to the way it felt. Her deep sea of anger was distorting the way that she saw the world and was causing her to believe things that actually did not happen. After the blow-up, she would return. This would happen regularly. She would return to a regular state of being super nice and eagerly compliant, even with the person that she would rage at. And it was very confusing to people, but they just figured, oh, she's just stressed out. Because she was so nice all the time, and people had a narrative that she was the nicest person on the planet. She mostly avoided romantic relationships. She was married a number of times. All of her husbands had relational traumas and were verbally abusive to her. She had a number of children. She had a complicated relationship with her children. On one hand, she was the perfect mother. She was nice, accommodating, would praise them all the time. But she would quickly turn on them at times, and she knew exactly how to make her children feel worthless and small. The children were very confused by this presentation. Her children eventually grew up and moved far away. They knew it was better that way. All right. So that is the end of that case example. It's pretty different from Michelle and pretty different from Aiden. Remember, with Aiden, he was much more of an enmeshed type and a childlike type with his mother and his wife. And Michelle was more childlike, life avoidant, enmeshed, and a little bit passive aggressive. With Tammy, we are looking at someone who shares two of the main of the main six types. One is the compliant and eager dependent. It's pretty clear in my description, in that Tammy adopted the submissive role very well. She's gracious, eager, compliant, accommodating, agreeable, can even be histrionic or over the top with her agreeableness, over the top compliance, and of course suppress deep feelings of anger and disapproval. And then the second type that she exhibits is the passive-aggressive dependent. Very dependent, overtly nice, low self-esteem, attracted to strong people, struggling between dependence and independence, compliant but secretly rageful, quietly stubborn, and hidden hostility. So that is my third and probably my final case presentation. I have another one, but there's a lot of overlap with the other one, so I might get into it. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the outcomes, mainly three different areas. The way when you have dependent personality disorder, how does it affect your relationships? How does it affect your likelihood of being victimized by others? And actually, how it leads to you victimizing others. People with dependent personality disorder, according to research, and I'll go over it, are absolutely capable of victimizing other people. I'm going to talk about some other things as well, but I'm also going to talk about the history. I'm going to go back to the first writers, psychoanalytic or object relations people through the various DSMs, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to talk about treatment of it. This is the Psychology Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This episode, if you're not a patron of the podcast, is going to end before the content begins. So if you want to hear this full episode, you have to become a patron by going to patreon.com. That's patreon.com. Become a patron of this podcast, and you'll hear this episode along with hundreds of others of our best episodes. We've made over 1,000 episodes, and 300 or so of those are our best episodes, and they're only available to patrons. So if you want to hear this and those episodes, go to patreon.com, become a patron. Do it now if you want. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.